Hi, I'm Ranting, and today we're talking about something on this channel that I've always wanted to talk about, and that is the history of prisons in the South post-Emancipation. We're going to talk about all the steps that happened after the Civil War because your history class didn't. And then talk a tad bit about the present state of prisons. They're not doing well, obviously, but I don't really think that's news to anyone. There's a whole TV show about scaring kids hetero so they won't go to prison. But what isn't always discussed is a complex series of events that led us to where we are now. And even less discussed is how that lack of discussion breeds, well, you've seen the news. Also, the lack of discussion feeds into that ignorance, which feeds into the dismissal of these issues. Judging from my community posts, I feel like a lot of you may already know this since you're anarchists, but either way, I feel like you're going to learn something new in this video anyway. If you don't know how we use what can be described as modern day slave labor, and you have no knowledge of what prisons look like in the South post-emancipation, then sit the fuck down because this video is for you. Before we get into that small announcement, we are officially monetized. I've been doing this for a little over a year, and I didn't expect to be monetized this fast, and it wouldn't have been possible without your generous support. That being said, monetization pays pretty shit unless you're like Cody Co or something. So if you want to support me and help me quit at least one of my jobs, then you can check out my Patreon or my Buy Me a Coffee account. And if you're new here, be sure to subscribe or you're racist. With all that out of the way, back to our irregularly scheduled programming. Hope you enjoy. Part 1. Not truly free. I think God intended to be slaves. Now since man has deranged God's plan, I think best we can do is keep him near a state of bondage as possible. My theory is feed them well, clothe them well, and then if they don't work, whip them well. What occurred after emancipation provides a different, not always discussed perspective when discussing the abolition of slavery. As I'm sure we all know, the 13th Amendment is said to abolish slavery, but due to that small part, except for the crime part that you should know about if you don't know about, this amendment was often misinterpreted to allow conditions of slavery, under the guise of rehabilitation for a crime, of course. It's worth noting this wasn't the intended purpose of the amendment, so Congress did enact the Civil Rights Act of 1866, but this pretty much did nothing to stop the abuses of the amendment. The South still found this loophole, and many cases demonstrated this. For example, in Virginia, the Supreme Court in Ruffin versus Commonwealth declared prisoners by virtue of their incarceration civilly dead. Woody Ruffin was indicted on a murder charge, and he declared that he wanted to be charged in the state he was alleged for the crime. However, the court found, since he was confined in the penitentiary, basically that he was a slave of the state. This is coming right out of the Civil War, so the court could only see him as a slave. It's said that the court concluded for the time being, during his service in the penitentiary, Ruffin is in a state of penal servitude to the state. As consequences of their crime, they not only forfeited their liberty, but all personal rights except those which the law in its humanity accords them. The Ruffin case, decided only 5 years after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, clearly conflated the status of slavery with involuntary servitude. I mention this case because it illustrates the Southern mindset just 5 years after the Civil War ended. But racism wasn't the only reason for this type of treatment. After the Civil War, the South was in bad shape because slavery was its main economic backbone. Planters and farmers struggled to survive. Their crops had been stolen from both sides, and they no longer had slaves to make their income on. Even reformers emphasized for the damage done. Carl Schurz believed that their cause was morally indefensible, though he admired their heroic sacrifice. Moving on. Worth noting is he was also concerned about the white rage that would appear after the abolition of slavery. With slavery abolished, Mississippi was moving towards a violent yet formal separation of the races, and the justice system of the time acted more as a savior of white supremacy than a justice system. They had just passed the first Jim Crow ordinance prohibiting black people from riding in railroad coaches set aside for white people. Following suit, the city of Natchez has segregated its river walkways in order to keep black men and white women apart. Black people who challenged these rules were often faced with arrest, humiliation, or worse. Whitelaw Reid of the New York Tribune writes, "More or less the same feeling had been apparent in Tennessee, Georgia, Alabama, and Louisiana. But in Mississippi, I found this expression in the fullest. However these men may have regarded the Negro slave, they hated the Negro freeman. However kind they may have been to the Negro property, they were virtually vindictive against the property that had escaped from their control." So the South wasn't really thrilled about black people being free. Shocker. Even though this happened, many black people who were enslaved chose to stay on the plantations. Among the hundreds of ex-slaves interviewed in the 1930s, about 40% claimed to have moved during the war itself or in the months immediately following emancipation. Many remained where they were, living as tenants of field hands on the same land they had worked at. Newspapers started reporting idle darkies were clogging the roads, stealing crops, livestock, jostling whites from sidewalks, and fouling the air with cigar smoke and profanity. Fouling the air with cigar smoke and profanity. Some predicted a full-on race war if black people didn't admit their inferiority to white people. Many Mississippi folk talked about moving away from the black people because they could not take living in the same space as them, but they didn't because they needed their labor. So with slavery being gone, they had no large-scale civilizing mechanism to keep black people subservient and also keep their economy flowing. Until Part 2, The Ghost of Slavery. The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery. W.E.B. Du Bois. In the fall of 1865, Governor Benjamin Humphrey addresses the Negro problem in Mississippi. The problem being they weren't property anymore. They were clogging up the air with cigar smoke and profanities. Sorry, that's just the whitest sentence I've ever heard. So, as I said earlier, Mississippi was in bad shape and needed something to control the newly freed population. The answer became what is known as convict leasing. Convict leasing is exactly what it sounds like. Wealthy landowners will lease out convicts to do work they needed done. We can thank Edmund Richardson for giving Mississippi this great idea. Richardson had about $3,000 and a few cotton balls after the war. Before the war, his assets were close to $1 million. After the war, he lost almost everything. In 1868, he struck a bargain with Mississippi. Richardson needed some cheap labor done on some land he had bought in the Delta, and the state had prisons overfilling with newly freed black people. Now, don't take this prisons filled with black people as some type of evidence of black criminality like the Mississippi people did. You see, after the war, 10 former slave states enacted these discriminatory laws known as black codes, which were laws that only applied to black people. Black codes listed specific crimes for the free Negro alone, including mischief, insulting gestures, cruel treatment to animals, vending of spirituous or intoxicating liquors, also prohibited from cohabitating with white people and having firearms. Unrelated, but remember when black gun ownership went up and a gun control conversation started back again? Me too. Anyway, moving on. You could also be arrested for handling money carelessly or being guilty of theft, and a crime for intermarriage was jail for life or death. At the heart of these codes were vagrancy laws. The Vagrancy Act provided that all free mulattoes and Negroes over the age of 18 must have written proof of job at the beginning of every year. Those found with no lawful employment shall be deemed vagrants and upon conviction fined a sum not exceeding $50. Given the huge number of cases, a vagrant couldn't possibly expect a normal trial, and this typically resulted with the sheriff deciding what justice was by himself, and that was typically just leasing them out to their old slave master to pay the fines. And this is where Richardson comes in. In Mississippi, he posed a contract to work these felons outside the prison walls. Before this, he promised to feed them, clothe them, and guard them, and treat them well. He promised to feed, clothe, guard, and treat them well. This is a former slave owner, mind you. The state agreed to pay him $18,000 a year for their maintenance and additional transportation, and Richardson got to keep all the profits he made from the convicts. Richardson's contract basically set down the guidelines that other states would follow. You may be thinking, white people were arrested, so they surely had to work as well, right? Well, no. He separated convicts by race, typically sending the black people to work at the Delta farms and keeping the white people in the penitentiary. Richardson's contract began the era of convict leasing in Mississippi. According to the Penitentiary Report of 1871, 146 males, 6 colored females were shipped to the Delta, while 61 white males and 25 colored females, the old and disabled, remained at the state penitentiary. There were no white female convicts at the time because the state frowned upon their incarceration. And in typical American fashion, Richardson was portrayed as a model businessman. At the time, convict leasing was a stopgap measure to deal with the influx of prisoners until a new prison could be built. From a business standpoint, it was ideal. It plugged a major weakness of the old system, the high fixed cost of labor. Under the sublease, an employer was not struck with a set number of prisoners over a long period of time. He did not have to feed, clothe, and guard them when there was little work to be done. He could now lease convicts according to his specific and seasonal needs. In terms of humanity, not so much. The prisoners ate and slept on bare ground without blankets or mattresses and often without clothes. They were punished for slow hoeing, 10 lashes, sorry planting, 5 lashes, and being light with cotton, which was also 5 lashes. Now, these may seem very familiar, like they were slave punishments, and that's because they were. Although this happened in prison, slave punishments were still being conducted inside the prison, and they weren't uncommon either. In the 1880s, the annual mortality rate for Mississippi's convict population ranged from 9 to 16%. Black people suffered a far higher mortality rate than white people. In 1882, for example, 126 of the 735 black state convicts died, as opposed to 2 of the 83 white people. Even more sinister, some of these convicts were children. By 1880, at least 1 convict in 4 was an adolescent or child. And the cherry on top is not a single convict lived to see a sentence of longer than 10 years. In 1870, Governor James Lusk Alcorn condemned a shocking spectacle of a group of convicts followed by keepers with loaded rifles, ready to shoot them as though they were dogs. A few months later, after he condemned this shocking spectacle, he extended Richardson's contract for another 2 years because he couldn't find another solution. Convict leasing didn't fully take hold in Mississippi until 1875, though. In the fall of that year, local Democrats launched their infamous Mississippi Plan, which was basically just their plan to ensure white supremacy. A white Democrat described the political campaign of 1875 as a revolutionary crusade. A black Republican called it the most violent time we've ever seen. You see, in redeeming Mississippi from the clutches of black power and Yankee control, Mississippi basically proved that poor whites could be easily tamed with appeals to race. These came in the form of laws like the Black Codes that only applied to black people, and also things like the Leasing Act. The Leasing Act permitted the towns and counties to work their convicts outside of the local jails. In theory, it applied to anyone who had breached a local ordinance and was sentenced to 1 year or less. In practice, this only applied to people who couldn't pay their fines, recently freed slaves. It wasn't until the Vicksburg incident that convict leasing was seriously challenged in Mississippi. Final destination was a hospital in Jackson where convicts were routinely sent to die. As stories like this became publicized, it created a wave of reformers and abolitionists who really mirrored today's abolitionists and reformers. In 1890, the Mississippi Convention abolished convict leasing by overwhelming vote. But this wasn't out of their humanity, mind you. It was only because poor whites and unions were upset that they couldn't get their share of the cake. In response to the opposition towards the convict leasing system, a transition was made to chain gangs. Although the concept of chain gangs was fairly similar to convict leasing, it basically differed in who they were leased to. Instead of leasing them to private corporations, they leased them to the states. And this pretty much solved all the issues with the poor whites and the unions. And that wasn't even abolished in every state until the 1950s. But before convict leasing would end, a generation of black prisoners will suffer under conditions that have been argued to be worse than slavery. Does that quote from Du Bois make a little more sense now? He was basically pointing out that this wasn't truly freedom. Some could say that the freedom never truly came. Part 3. Modern day convict leasing. So, knowing after Emancipation that the South designed laws to send black people back to jail where they will work for pennies and face punishments and conditions similar to slavery, what did we learn? I hope something, at least. Now let's talk about how we're fucking up in the present. We'll refer to the South a lot since we're already dragging them. Their prisons still don't look good, obviously. In January 2018, prisoners in Florida went on strike to protest what they called modern day slavery. Yes, they said that. In response to the people asking for an actual wage because they were, working, Florida's prisons put some of them in solitary confinement. So, the torture aspect never left. Florida is also one of the 5 states where you're allowed to pay prisoners nothing for their work. So this burden often falls on the family of incarcerated individuals. Florida is also one of the 43 states that charge prisoners a stay behind bars fee. They charge you to live in a prison where they forcefully take you by force. In a report titled "Charging Inmates Perpetuates Mass Incarceration," Eisen wrote that by 2004, an estimate of 1/3 of county jails and 50% of prisons in the United States charge a daily housing fee. Looking at this, I found today we have a much easier time calling it servitude and slavery, but whatever you want to fucking call it, a nation that prides itself on freedom should not be engaging. So apparently there's 3 laws that were in theory supposed to give prisoners a better pay, but doesn't seem to be working out that way. There's been this ongoing fight to consider prison workers actual employees so they can receive, actual pay or at least a minimum wage. But the 3 laws in theory that are supposed to give them a living wage are the Summers Act, the Fair Labor Standards Act, and the Justice System Improvement Act. The Fair Labor Standards Act doesn't apply to work programs conducted inside the prison and for the benefit of prisons, such as cleaning, cooking, and laundering. The court said that the FSLA doesn't apply to prisoners because their relationship is not one of employment. Prisoners are taken out of the national economy. Prison work is often designed to train and rehabilitate prisoners. Prisoners' living standards are determined by what the prison provides, and most such labor does not compete with private employers. They also say this occupies their time that will be normally filled with mischief. They also say it's a method of seeing that prisoners bear at a cost of their incarceration, which I think being in jail is a big enough cost, but so their logic basically is, since the prison is providing you with housing and food, that the prison deserves a cut of the check. But all these fees accumulating, it totals up into prices that the prisoners can never afford, and you're still responsible for them after your release. One man was sued by the Florida Department of Corrections for almost $55,000, occurring during his 3-year incarceration at Florida State Prison. which has an average of about $50 per day. So while the court may argue that prisoners don't need protection under the Fair Labor Standards Act, this is not a real reality when you have to pay to stay in prison and you're being paid literal fucking pennies. The 2003 report indicates that states pay inmates wages an average of 93 cents to $4 a day. However, when a private prison pays its inmates, it's usually about 16 cents per day. The Summers Act was supposed to restrict the sale of prison-made goods in interstate commerce, but when they passed the Justice System Improvement Act, which ushered in the PI program, which is a prison work program, partially dismissed a lot of the issues they were trying to cure with the Summers Act. And if a state has not complied with PI, it may sell goods outside the state where it is located. If a state prison is not PI certified, it doesn't have to pay the inmates any mandated wages. Non-PI certified state prisons pay their prisoners between $17 and $5.35 an hour. 17 cents. There's a lot of prison work programs, but the worst are usually those ran by private interests. The most successful being Correction Corporations of America and the GEO Group. And they're both pulling in lots of money. It's almost as if this incentivizes them to keep their prisons filled. Now, you would think since these private interests usually rake in more money that they would be paying their inmates better, but no. Private prisons pay an average of 17 cents per hour, and the CCA pays at most 50 cents per hour for highly skilled positions. In 2016, the Justice Department got involved and recommended that officials allow the contracts with corporations to expire so that the state could take over again. But that would only apply to the 13 federal facilities that have contracted with corporations. Now, what that means is it wouldn't apply to private ran prisons, which house majority of our prisoners. Now, many people have been asking the courts to just answer the question, are prisoners considered employees or servants? And they haven't given a direct answer. They explored this issue in Hale versus Arizona. So this prisoner worked for a belt buckle company who was selling things to Buckle, the Marines, U-Haul, Mountain Belt, I don't know what that is. And he argued by paying him and the other prisoners who were being paid shit for making these buckles that were getting sent outside the prison, that he should be paid at least minimum wage according to the Fair Labor Standards Act. And it went nowhere, even though that's pretty fucking sound logic to me. A lot of cases like this, and I'll cite some in the description, but we're still using the 13th Amendment to justify it. The Supreme Court has said the economic reality of prison work must be decided, but the obvious economic reality is that they're paying them slave wages. The economic reality is that they're doing work that most people can do outside the prison and being paid less than those outside the prison, which should be illegal. Some people argue that we should pay them at least minimum wage, but I don't really think they should be working at all because I don't think we should have prisons, but that's a topic for another day. And the court has also argued that they gain skills by working these jobs they can use once they get outside of prison, but that assumes that one, you'll be able to find a job, and two, it just assumes it assumes you'll be able to find a job. And I don't know if you know this, but it's pretty goddamn hard to get a job with a criminal record. In conclusion, whether you want to call it involuntary servitude or slavery like I do, we shouldn't be engaging in this, and we should probably do something about that loophole in the amendment. Maybe burn the entire Constitution. A nation that prides itself on freedom and has a national holiday that no one asked for, dedicated to the freeing of slaves, should not be benefiting off of this. But I think that literally might require not having prisons. But stay tuned for that conversation. Hope you enjoyed the parts and chapters and dramatic transitions. But what do you think? Did you like the video? Did you learn something new? Are you going to subscribe? Are you high right now? Do you ever get nervous? Subscribe to the channel for more content, and may your vibes be chill.